Hi there, it's Tom Jordan. We've got a very big show today. We're dealing with this continued threat to shut down speech. Even though the election was won by Donald Trump, the left's effort continues. So we're going to really dive deep into that. But before we get to that, just an update on this long-awaited outcome of which party will have majority over the House of Representatives. And here it is. We got, if you're a conservative, good news. Republicans are set to retain, as you can see the numbers there, control of the House. This is we're calling it, and many different media outlets are calling it as well, this pivotal moment for the GOP as President Donald Trump prepares to implement his America First agenda. Again, multiple news sources and outlets are projecting that the GOP will hold the majority, secured essentially by what was happening out west in Arizona. First-term Congressman Juan Ciscomani's win in Arizona's 6th district there, where he secured a rematch victory against the Democrat there, Kirsten Engel. So Ciscomani beating Engel in this, which pretty much secures the victory for the GOP in the House. The NRCC chairman, Richard Hudson, said the win comes because Republicans never lost sight of their mission. They were disciplined. The GOP's focus on issues, including securing the U.S.-Mexico border, tackling inflation, and addressing the nation's drug and crime crises. House Speaker Mike Johnson came out. He said the House's intent is to hit the ground running with these policies that prioritize American families and American workers. So they're going right down the middle. They're really, I think, acknowledging what most Americans really are concerned about, what they care about. Democrats, they had hoped to reclaim the House of Representatives, but they faced a lot of setbacks, including a change in their presidential ticket, with Vice President Kamala Harris never really answering questions about policies that seem to have suddenly changed for her after she also suddenly replaced President Joe Biden after his rocky debate season. All right, so that's a quick update. We'll keep watching this, and hopefully we're going to get a major player in the House of Representatives on the program tomorrow. We'll keep you updated on that. All right, now I've got a question for you. Did Donald Trump win and Kamala Harris lose the presidential election as a result of too many people being allowed to talk and too many people being allowed to share their political opinions? That is exactly what some people on the left are arguing. That's what they are saying. Yes, too much free speech going on, and that's election interference, they argue. And more people talking is a threat to democracy, is what they claim. So now there are certain voices on the left. They are calling for stricter control over free speech, and they are attributing this loss to so-called misinformation or disinformation from right-leaning media. Instead of doing what they should do is addressing the lies of the left-leaning media and their own failed policies, or acknowledging Trump's support across a diverse an array of groups. They're doubling down instead on claims that Americans are misinformed, and in some cases they are racist or sexist because they voted for Donald Trump. Like, that's all the evidence that they need to make those accusations. So these left-leaning media outlets, which openly favored Kamala Harris, they're now pushing to suppress alternative media as the establishment can no longer monopolize public opinion. So there's that, and all of that is coming up in just a few seconds. We'll talk with Khalil Habib, the Allison and Dorothy Rouse Professor in Politics at Hillsdale College. It is an amazing conversation that we're going to bring your way here in just a few moments. Also, just a reminder to chime in. We'd like to hear from you. You can comment. You could ask me questions as well in the comments section, and I'll get to those in a moment. Remember, YouTube, Facebook, X, we're taking those comments in real time. We'll answer those. And then, of course, this podcast lives on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. And the best way you can help Tom Jordan Live, please simply subscribe. Whichever platform you're on, click the notification bell if you could. We'll notify you of new content throughout the day. Won't bug you too much, but we really appreciate you watching, listening, and then sharing our content as well. It's free of charge, but that helps us tremendously. So from my heart to yours, thank you very much. Okay, media bias, the intensified censorship goals. Margot Cleveland, if you haven't read it, she wrote a great piece in the Federalist the other day, and in it she warns that after Trump's recent election win, certain leftist groups have taken the defeat as a reason to clamp down even harder on free speech rather than reassessing their own policies or their own spreading of demonstrable disinformation, their own lies. They're not addressing that. They want to control the narratives even more to prevent similar electoral outcomes in the future. Well, wait, Tom, what do you mean the legacy media's own lies and their own disinformation? What do you base that claim on, Tom? You ask, which some people do. Well, here's just a smattering, just a few, a sampling, if you will. So we can go back to the Russia collusion narrative that was CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, everybody in the legacy media was covering this. They spent years pushing the Trump-Russia collusion story. Totally unverified stories about secret contacts and alleged meetings. All of that was later totally discredited. There was never any proof that any of that had existed, but the media ran that down our throats for years, trying to get Donald Trump out of office. All of that later discredited, and yet they dominated the media coverage in Donald Trump's first term. And they shaped this narrative that proved to be totally baseless and disinformation, and ultimately led to Joe Biden's victory in 2020, which was the whole point. And speaking of 2020, the Hunter Biden laptop story. In the final weeks of the 2020 election, the New York Post published a story about Hunter Biden's laptop, which contained incriminating information about Joe Biden, his corruption, in profiting off his higher office and his policy decisions in exchange for millions of dollars. Is a major story that the left-leaning media quickly dismissed. They ignored it. They pretended it was what? Russian disinformation. That whole thing again. Russia's involved here, and that's what this is. It wasn't true. They even thought, I mean, the whole thing that the Hunter Biden laptop was later totally authenticated and verified. In fact, it had been verified already by the New York Post at the time of publication. What was that, September or October of 2020? Verified. So that's another lie, disinformation that the media cooperated in. Then there's the Charlottesville, very fine people lie. And for many years, even still today, left-leaning media reported that Donald Trump referred to neo-Nazis as very fine people when the opposite was true. Trump explicitly condemned the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists time and again, and including that very same speech that they claimed he did the opposite. During that speech, they ignored it. You got the COVID-19 origins, the lab leak theory, the intense lockdowns on U.S. citizens based on a coordinated effort to strip away civil liberties and rights with almost zero health benefits from the lockdowns. They were wrong, in fact. The lockdowns did not work. The vaccine lies, another one that the media still is not allowed to talk about. Did you know that? They're not. There's the 2020 riots as these mostly peaceful protests. Selective coverage of election fraud allegations. There's the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation and, the sexual assault allegations that were not true. Deflection from inflation and economic issues in 2022, January 6th coverage versus the 2020 riots. Censorship collaboration with big tech that the government was involved in. All of that was truly disinformation by left-wing, corporate-controlled, and government-influenced news media. And they're the ones who want to shut down free speech based on disinformation. So they break it down. I mean, there's three theories as to why Kamala Harris lost this election. There's, post-election, the media has kind of floated these theories to explain, how was it that Kamala Harris lost? And some are suggesting, well, voters genuinely rejected the far-left policies of Kamala Harris. That would be the right assessment. Others, however, claim the win reflects deep-rooted prejudice among Americans, that this divisive rhetoric aims to smear Trump supporters instead of acknowledging the failure of policies that don't resonate with the American public. They don't. And then there's the allegations against right-wing media. The most concerning response to me after Trump's win is the belief that Harris's loss was due to misinformation from conservative media outlets. The left-leaning press claiming that Donald Trump's victory came from distorted reporting by platforms like, Fox News or Newsmax or other right-leaning networks. Independent podcasts like this one, accusing them of brainwashing the public. It's staggering media hypocrisy and Democratic Party hypocrisy. who overwhelmingly supported Kamala Harris, the media did, with all this positive coverage, ignoring her major gaffes, ignoring her requirements, her stipulations that the media must agree to before she agrees to do an interview with them. You can't talk about this, that, or the other. You can't because it's going to make her look bad. Joe Rogan, I don't know if you know this, but the other day he said, yeah, one of the stipulations is that I couldn't ask her about the legalization of marijuana. And they asked him, well, why didn't Kamala Harris want to talk about that? And he said, well, it's because she locked up like thousands of people when she was prosecutor and she was the attorney general in California. And she's the district attorney in San Francisco. And she doesn't want that out there. So she's completely non-transparent about her own record and about what she truly stands for. So they're now out there criticizing conservative media for, its influence. You can't influence people. You can't have opinions. So the base question in all of this then becomes, how do we discover what's true and what's false? Do we do that by minimizing speech or by maximizing speech? The founders of this country knew the answer to that, clear as day, and so should we. So I got into that and why the First Amendment should never be done away with my conversation earlier with a professor at Hillsdale College. Here's that conversation. Okay, let's bring in Khalil Habib. He's the Associate Professor of Politics. Allison and Dorothy Rouse, Professor in Politics at Hillsdale College. It is so nice to have you. I really appreciate your time because this is, as you know, a very, very and incredibly important topic.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I wouldn't miss it.
Yeah, thank you. So this election, I think it showed a lot of things, as I think it did in 2020. But there was a real effort, to silence certain speech out there. 2020, we saw it now in 2024, and calling it, disinformation, this guise, this kind of ruse, if you want to call it that. That information over there is disinformation, so we need to shut it down. So I guess I'll start off with this before we get real deep into it. But is that a reason enough to censor somebody? Like, if you determine that's what someone's opinion is wrong, is that enough to actually silence and censor that speech?
No, absolutely not. In fact, the only way you can actually combat disinformation is allowing a complete freedom of speech, people to actually push back on claims. To silence them is more propaganda, and it's an infringement on our right to free speech. But the only way to combat disinformation, misinformation, however you want to spin it, is to actually maximize the amount of free speech possible, not limit it.
It's the exact opposite, and that's the whole. I
Mhm.
mean, if you want to find, the foundation of this government is that argumentation was very instrumental in framing even the Constitution. You had to argue, go back and forth, different opinions, and hopefully get to some realm of truth in the end of all of that. And I completely agree with that. And I think this is important too because we have to define, who really is the arbiter of what is true, because you can easily make the argument, but the ones that are claiming the other side is filled with disinformation in their own right have had their own, years of demonstrable disinformation that they've spouted through the media as well, right? So who is the arbiter of what's true?
Well, obviously, the political parties become the arbiter, and historically, and at least most recently, it's been the Democratic Party has been the arbiter. And now, when Elon took over Twitter, he had to fire people who are even in the intelligence agencies who are in there. So it's either you have free speech or you don't. But you brought up a really good point, actually, in your last remark. You opened by saying that it's completely contrary to the form of government that we have. That's true. I mean, that kind of censorship completely undermines the principles of the American founding. In Federalist 9 and 10, for example, the Federalists wanted to ensure that there was no censorship. There wasn't an effort to, in the interest even of having peace in the country, to give everybody the same opinion, whether it's through political correctness or limiting what they can hear and what they can say. They literally say the only way you can actually control the effects of factions and free speech that could lead to any kind of conflict is to just open it up as much as possible and not limit free speech. So it's contrary completely to the American founding to even want to consider restricting speech, especially around elections. I mean, people are making decisions that are necessary for our national security, people's personal well-being. There's too much at stake, and that's exactly why the powers that be want to have it censored.
Okay, well, to that point, because, in the state of Michigan, for example, there is a Secretary of State. You mentioned elections. she's kind of the overseer of the elections in the state. And there are some people who say, hey, I witnessed some fraud here. I witnessed this, or I think this happened instead of that. And she, along with the attorney general in Michigan, along with the governor, and a lot of people within that party are saying that's disinformation, that is dangerous. We need to isolate that information, identify who's spouting that disinformation, take photos of that person, and turn it into my office. I mean, that's how crazy it's become. And I actually had a conversation the other day with even a member of the opposite party who said, well, there are certain things that you really do have to censor because it becomes dangerous. Like you can't yell fire in a theater. And that's often used as a reason to silence certain speech that might be perceived as, quote unquote, dangerous to democracy. Is that in any realm of, I guess, when you frame it within the Constitution, is that in any sense a valid argument that there are certain things that might shut down democracy that we need to shut them up? And if it involves elections specifically, that's something that we could deem as maybe civilly or even criminally punishable by law.
I am not aware of any restrictions on speech that would undermine democracy. Democracy literally means the ability to speak and that everybody has an equal say and voice. Now, the reason why you can't yell fire, for example, in a theater is because obviously if it's untrue, you're putting people's physical lives in immediate danger, And of course, there are restrictions on, for example, speech related to espionage or treason. You can't hide behind free speech and say, well, I was just passing information to China or whomever, as exercising my free speech. So those obviously have some direct impact, but the ability to challenge an election, the ability to hold elected officials accountable, that is perfectly permitted. And in fact, somebody who had no dog in the fight whatsoever, Alexis de Tocqueville, a great French political philosopher, visited the United States at the time of Andrew Jackson's presidency. And he said one of the great advantages that America has over France, where he came from, is that the media and the citizens can put together associations and newspapers. Today, he would say podcasts and radio, and they can go after elected officials as much as they can, and sometimes even misinformation. And Tocqueville said, even though that might happen, it's still better than any kind of censorship, because what other ways do you have to hold elected officials accountable, if not the ability to call into question what they do, challenge some of their policies, or at least articulate what you think one should consider as a representative? So there's just, no matter where you look at, whether you look at the American founding or from statesmen abroad who visited the country, there are more arguments in favor of freedom of speech than there are restrictions. Usually it's those who can't win in a transparent policy that want that kind of restriction. Democrats have historically never been completely honest about what their policies are. Trump, whether you like him or not, has been very blunt, almost to a fault. And so you have to think about, why is it that you want to restrict things? People have gotten used to managing a narrative and manufacturing public opinion. So things like Twitter and social media have become, quote, dangerous in their minds. And even Hillary Clinton said that if we don't censor, we lose control of the narrative. Well, what does that tell you? That's in the interest of those running for office and maintaining power. It's not in the interest of the citizens who have a God-given right for freedom of speech.
Right, and I know I'm very familiar with that statement from Hillary Clinton and other Democrats. This is the party that wants to censor speech, and she said that basically she needs to do a better job, and the Democratic Party needs to do a better job of collusion and colluding with the news media out there to make sure they have the proper narrative. And I can,
Exactly.
look back. It's not like distant memory. It's very recent history where there have been a number of narratives that have been propagated by the Democratic Party that were demonstrably false, but the media went along with them. And we could just name a few. There was the Hunter Biden laptop, that was somehow Russian disinformation. There was the whole, Russia Donald Trump collusion hoax. Members of the news media saying that the president, Donald Trump, was an asset of Russia. He was a spy committing espionage. None of that was true. There wasn't evidence to support it. And those kinds of things continued even through this recent election, where Kamala Harris was not transparent. She wouldn't answer questions, and the media seemed lockstep with her. What does that spell to you in terms of, okay, if even the media is not doing what, the Frenchmen who came over and observed how great that was, that we have a free press, they're no longer doing that. Where are we now when we speak of freedom of speech? if even the watchdogs are now in on it, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, there's a very important number that came up in the recent election, and that is uh, many demographics had realigned in this election and voted for Trump. The one that I found quite interesting was the ages between 18 and 29 historically have always, in other words, sort of college town, young, have always historically broken in majorities with the Democratic candidate. This time around, that wasn't the case. Trump closed the distance and gap in many of those areas, and in some places, even won them outright. And I asked and I've polled many, many people across the country within that age demographic, why do you think this happened? And they said, well, because we get our information from Twitter, from social media. And when they look at no one watches the legacy media. The legacy media is fighting a current war using last war's munitions, and they're just out of date. They haven't realized that no one's paying attention to them anymore. In fact, even Chris Wallace has recently declared that he's leaving mainstream media and he's going to open up a podcast. I think what has happened is something that is extremely healthy for the country. It's the social media, the Twitter phenomenon, the YouTube, whatever else, shows like yours and others. They've defragmented the monopoly that legacy medias have had, which literally became instruments of political parties of both the left and the right, depending on which channel. No one, they're not relevant anymore, except with an older generation. But the younger generation, nobody listens to them. Everybody was aware that everything was contrived with Kamala. Ages ago, nobody would have been aware because you have now social media where people can get immediate feedback and immediate information, some of it misinformation, some of it not. But at least it's too big and quick to control. So I think what's great about that is that the parties moving forward are going to have to realize there's very few places that they can hide and manufacture their policies. They have to be transparent. Those who love the legacy media and the manufacturing almost like of a Hollywood set delivery of their policies are afraid to run on what they really want. So, for example, Kamala would run certain ads in Michigan about the Middle East, and then other ads in New York that would say the complete opposite. You can't do that anymore. You're literally watching somebody fighting a new war that they've never seen before with old weapons. It's not going to work, and it's going to set them back. And the election results prove it.
Yeah, you're 100% right. The election results do prove this because there
Mm-hmm.
is an impact through social media that I am now grateful exists because I've seen in my own personal career what has happened in legacy,
Mm-hmm.
type of
Mm-hmm.
media outlets, which I had to leave for that very same reason. They were controlling
Mm-hmm.
what we were allowed as reporters to do. We could not
Mm-hmm.
cover certain issues any longer because it
Mm-hmm.
didn't fit the narrative. These are newsrooms around the entirety of the country here that are
Mm-hmm.
now engaged in this. And thankfully, the technology is to the point now where we can have these open dialogues. We can question those in power like we're supposed to do, like they did, a couple hundred years ago. To that
Mm-hmm.
point, social media and now Twitter or X, after he was purchased by this guy, Elon Musk, you might have heard of him. There's a lot of pushback against him. And there's these reports out, there's groups like the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They do now have strategies in place to kill Musk's X because Musk and X and Twitter, whatever you want to call it, they are no longer censoring conservative speech like the other social media platforms have been for quite some time, YouTube and some of these other places that are actively doing that kind of things. So, how far do you think these groups, whatever the ruse is, whatever their guise, the guise of hate speech, we need to silence it because conservatives are filled with hate, which thankfully, again, to your point, most people are realizing that's not exactly true.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, how far do you think they're willing to go to shut down Twitter and any platform like this one, even in order to censor and silence those who disagree with the mainstream narrative?
Never underestimate the extent to which any of these power players want to maintain control. If it means shutting you down and they get to live another year, they'll do it. I don't put anything past them. Elon's an interesting phenomenon because he was asked the very same question actually a couple of years ago when he first bought it, and somebody asked him what would happen if the powers that be swarm around you, destroy advertising, bring it down, and he said, "Well, this time." The whole world will know. And I thought that was interesting. One of the things
Hmm.
that Elon did that was crucial in this election is any shenanigans that were going on, he was able to echo it across the world. And now his app is number one all over the planet, which is astonishing. It wasn't before. Because mostly it was used for color revolutions and propaganda, and he finally defragmented it. So let me give you an example. When that terrible storm came and hit the South, no one, I didn't know that there were efforts to prevent him from bringing Starlink down there,
Hmm.
and efforts to keep Trump and others from helping. The only reason people knew that was because of X. And at this point, the cat's out of the bag. It's too big to bring down. And at this point, if they were to attempt to do that, their tyranny would show. It would become so obvious. He was trying to do good. And you can say, well, he was doing it because it's an election. Who cares? The fact of the matter is, he was there to do something and offer a service, and there were efforts to prevent him from doing that. Now the whole world knows. Here I am in Michigan, and I found out about it, and I would not have found out about it if there wasn't an alternative to these media outlets. So I think there, of course, for that reason, precisely because he's so effective, he's literally stripping them of whatever manufacturing tools they had for public opinion right before our very eyes. The other thing is, I don't think you can underestimate how much Trump is also responsible for destroying legacy media. On the one hand, they're responsible because they just overplayed their hand. But as he was attacking them constantly as fake news, people started paying attention. And then when they would weigh what they would see with their own eyes on one channel with what the unedited looked like, it became pretty clear that he was actually right, that they were the, as he said, the enemies of the people. Now, whether he intuited that or not, the fact of the matter is the American founders saw anyone who infringing on freedom of speech as enemies of the people. Alexis de Tocqueville saw anyone who infringed on freedom of speech as enemies of the people.
Hmm.
Political power gets extremely dangerous if it is concentrated. And the only tools we have as citizens is the ability to speak openly, to connect, to form friendships, associations, and without any restriction on our ability to push back against power, to challenge and to articulate. That's exactly why there's a drive by those who are frankly losing the American mind, why they want to censor. They could not remain in power if they couldn't manufacture a vision of what they want, and the people have voted against it. It's there. Elon's too big. I think there's no going back.
Yeah, and Elon wasn't Donald Trump. He was a different animal. He came out of more of a liberal mindset, and even he was
Correct.
seeing in real time what was happening. And I do give he and I give Donald Trump a lot of credit because back in 2016, he was calling out the media as being fake. And me at that time working in the legacy media news outlets, I would watch and pay attention. I'd be a part of these 1 hour, 2 hour press conferences, and I would see the entirety of what was being said. And then I would see how our newsrooms were covering it, and it was fake. It wasn't
Hmm.
true. It's not what was
Hmm.
said, and it wasn't
Hmm.
exact. It wasn't what happened either. So Donald Trump
Hmm.
at that time got a lot of pushback saying, "Oh, he's going after journalists, the arbiters of truth and the protectors of democracy." No, they're going. He's going after them because you're exactly the opposite of what you're pretending to be. And so
Hmm.
I'm very grateful for that. And he stood his ground against severe opposition.
Hmm.
That might be what it takes, right? You got to
Hmm.
stand your ground, see it all the way through because eventually the truth rises to the surface, right? So,
Hmm.
how would you recommend people do that? I mean, you look back to the founders, they stood their
Hmm.
ground and there was
Hmm.
tremendous sacrifice in order to allow these freedoms to exist.
Hmm.
And for this great country, how would you recommend, getting that spine of steel, your face like flint, nothing's going to move
Hmm.
you uh,
How?
to get to the
What is
truth?
what was the question? How to what now?
How do you recommend, what was it about the founders that gave them this
I see.
spine of steel to make
Got it.
sure that regardless of the opposition, they were not going to be moved?
Yeah, that's a great question. They were steeped in the Bible, the philosophies of John Locke and Montesquieu. And if you look at the early American founding, those were the three main resources that they would often cite when they were debating the country and its institutions. For John Locke and for the Bible, we have these God given natural rights, and among them is the ability to articulate what our views are and to debate. It's a Western tradition to consider ourselves as collaborators in a political project. So the whole purpose of government, according to Locke, is not just to simply protect your life and your liberty, but to also protect your ability to speak. How else in a representative government can you possibly represent the consent of the governed if they're not allowed to push back and to articulate and to speak? I mean, it's just literally woven into the fabric of the country. And the founders in Federalist 9, again, any one of your viewers who wants to take a look, it's Federalist Papers 9 and 10. They weighed the possibility, should we just limit speech in an effort to just make people get along and not
Hmm.
have strife and conflict? Should we just give everybody the same opinions, i.e., introduce something like what we would today call political correctness? And they resoundingly said, absolutely not. The only option is to have a large confederated republic like ours that would allow maximum freedom of speech. There was no other way to deal with debate in politics than to and to hold again elected officials accountable. You see it even in the tradition of the early Renaissance. Machiavelli, in his discourses, says that there should be no restrictions even on making accusations against public officials. Not slander, that's different. If
Yep.
it can be proven in a court of law and you have evidence of any kind of malfeasance, there's no other way to literally check those who enter power in powerful positions and are ostensibly representing the consent of the governed. So the founders were steeped in that tradition, from John Adams to of the Federalists, even the Anti-Federalists. Nobody was in favor of restrictions of speech, especially after they had fought the American Revolution. They didn't think that the purpose of government was to limit it; it was to give it complete open space. That's why they also adopted Roman names. It was a throwback to the era when the Romans would deliberate openly and publicly and without fear. It is very American to embrace that kind of freedom of speech, and it's frankly completely un American to restrict it.
It's a shame how popular it is now to try to silence quote unquote disinformation to the point where
Mm-hmm.
now our elected leaders are publicly stating that is the right thing to do to counter hate and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
One final
Mm-hmm.
question, I'll let you go. When you
Sure.
talk about, the United States right now, what's happening in this country and our culture is not unique in the effort to silence speech. There's a lot of international efforts to do this. A lot of foreign entities. You mentioned Elon Musk's X is doing quite well overseas. And
Mm-hmm.
I think back to the
Mm-hmm.
Arab Spring when people were starting to realize, oh wait, there's social media here, and these countries that were silencing individuals couldn't do it because they had Twitter back then, and these
Mm-hmm.
social media. It's
Mm-hmm.
very freeing to a lot of people, but there is a strong concerted effort internationally to shut down Elon Musk and conservative networks or voices in that regard. How entrenched do you think this current iteration of the U.S. government is in those international efforts?
Well, I don't know about that, but I don't know an accurate answer to that. All I know is the reason why it's global is that for centuries, since frankly after the World War II, governments have gotten too big, too powerful, and they've started to control what their constituents hear and see. What Trump did is he made it possible for people around the world to see that there can be a populist movement that can reclaim the governments that were ostensibly there to serve them. That's why he was such a world phenomenon and why many countries wanted to try to stamp out Elon. But again, he's too big. Every time you do that, no matter what country you're in now, it looks like an obvious play to restrict freedom. Why would you do that? If you were governing in the interest of your citizens, wouldn't you want to be as transparent as possible? Look what Elon is doing now. He's now apparently head of the Department of Efficiency or whatever it's called. And he said
Yes.
they're going to post everything that they're going to consider online, everything, so that there's be total transparency. Well, if you believe in what you're doing, you want to be proud of it, you should be open about it. Why have anything even closed door like that? And it's too late. It's over. People now are aware because of social media and the internet that for a long time they have been kept in the dark. They're not going back. Once you have a whiff of freedom, you're not going to put the yoke of tyranny on yourself again. And so all over the world, you can see that people are craving to find real information. And people aren't stupid. Most people can tell disinformation from misinformation. And when you open up freedom of speech entirely, there's ways to check against that. You just let the free market of ideas shake that all out. How much is the U.S. government involved in anything like that overbroad? I don't know, but all I know is that they weren't able to pull it off here, and I think globally people are seeing what can be done
Mm.
with respect to overzealous politicians, and it's always the answer is always freedom, just like our founders had argued.
Yeah, got to hold them accountable. And by the way, I wouldn't have known that FEMA had prevented aid going to Donald Trump supporters during the
Hmm.
hurricane in North Carolina
Hmm.
if it wasn't
Hmm.
for social media because the news
Hmm.
outlets were not covering it. They were
Hmm.
they were legitimately ignoring houses with Donald Trump signs in the yards Don't give them
Hmm.
aid after this hurricane.
Hmm.
Give it to the others as well. That is absolutely
Hmm.
wrong. So again, the importance of honesty and transparency, and nowadays alternative media sources, unlike the legacy media outlets. So I appreciate your time. I'm really grateful for what you're fighting
Likewise.
for, and you're
Thank you
you're a
very
great
much.
voice there at Hillsdale College. Khalil Habib is the associate professor of politics. Allison and Dorothy Rouse, professor in politics. Khalil, so nice to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Likewise. I hope we do it again. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Take
Thanks so
care.
much. Yeah, pretty amazing. So Khalil Habib, good guy. By the way, he sent me an article from the Daily Mail because he did bring up the whole notion that the legacy media people are running away from it because they can't be trusted anymore, and that's true. The ratings are crashing at outlets like MSNBC and CNN, and the Daily Mail put out an article, I think it was yesterday, that says that CNN, just one of them, because of falling and crashing ratings, they're going to axe their top stars in layoffs. That'll see hundreds fired as ratings continue to tank. We're looking at guys like Anderson Cooper, maybe is going to be let go. He makes $20 million a year for pretending to be a journalist when really he's an opinion host that's staunchly opposed to conservatives. Same for Caitlin Collins. I think she makes $3 million a year. The other one, I forget her name, $6 million a year. So that's what's happening. And I don't know. I hope journalists wake up that they have been wrong. They need to have and engage in some self-confrontation to get back to some sense of the whole reason why they're there in the first place, making these tens of millions of dollars a year. You're not doing your job. So thankfully, people are waking up to this. And listen, I'm going to get your comments and your questions in just a moment here. I really want to hear from you. We got several minutes left in the broadcast here or the program, but I just want to I guess communicate how disturbed I am by the way that some of the left, they have reacted to Donald Trump's win over Kamala Harris, seeing it as proof that Americans are either misinformed or they're intolerant, rather than facing the reality that people rejected extreme policies. This refusal to self-reflect, to even consider that maybe their message is out of sync with the majority of Americans, is a dangerous precedent that will fuel more division and sow distrust across the political spectrum. They got to deal with this. And the argument that, misinformation is what led to Trump's win is not just flawed, it's wrong, it's incorrect. It's an excuse to undermine free speech by claiming that alternative media is to blame. Certain factions on the left are now laying the groundwork for a more coordinated attack on any source that does not align with their views, which should worry anyone who values an open marketplace of ideas. And for the left to paint Trump's win as the result of racial or gender prejudice ignores the surge in minority and female support for Donald Trump. This blanket accusation of bigotry is not only a gross oversimplification, but it's also, deeply insulting to the millions of Americans who simply voted based on policy and principles, not on racial or gender animus. What's particularly unsettling is how some leftist media figures are calling for stricter controls over what they call misinformation, even as they sidestep their own role in shaping these biased and misinformed narratives. Legacy media overwhelmingly favoring Kamala Harris, showering Kamala Harris with positive news coverage, while Donald Trump faced an onslaught of negativity because they were engaging in disinformation. Yet they are so quick to decry these alternative outlets as slanted and dangerous because they're slanted, unwilling to admit their own bias. The growth of the alternative media and platforms like X, which Elon Musk has allowed to become a true forum for free speech, is a positive development. It empowers Americans to explore multiple perspectives, and that terrifies those on the left who want a monopoly on public discourse because they know that losing control of the narrative means losing the ability to shape opinions and manipulate perceptions. The coordination between leftist groups, foreign governments, and these tech giants to silence certain viewpoints isn't some conspiracy theory. It's happening right now. We all know it is. These efforts to regulate speech on social media have nothing to do with protecting people from misinformation and everything to do with consolidating control over who gets to speak and what they're allowed to say. And what we are seeing is an international alliance of sorts where foreign entities are eager to stifle speech on American platforms to keep U.S. public opinion in line with globalist agendas. The fact that the left is working hand in hand with these international interests to silence opposing views is a total betrayal of America's foundational commitment to free speech and independence from foreign influence. So the legacy media's hypocrisy could not be more evident. It's all around you. They control the majority of mainstream channels, debate platforms, and these narrative threads, yet they label right-leaning media as dangerous for merely existing. If legacy media truly valued truth and transparency, they'd be pushing for more voices and more viewpoints, not trying to shut down those who don't conform to their worldview or firing them, kicking them out of their newsrooms. The left wants to control what they deem truth and misinformation, effectively setting themselves up as the arbiters of what people can and cannot know. Not just say, but what you're allowed to think. They're suggesting that only their version of events is credible, while dismissing the opinions of millions who see things a whole lot differently than they do. It's an undemocratic arrogance that is entirely out of touch with American principles of free speech and intellectual diversity. Wanted to get that off my chest. Important to say, and it's important for all of us to understand what's really happening. I think more people do. Love to take your comments and your questions here, and thanks for your time so far. Let's bring them up on the screen here. Cameron Harris is watching them. Taz is back. The Dems king of misinformation. Masks stop the spread of COVID. Vaccines will prevent you from getting COVID. Kamala has the border secure. Joe Biden sharp as a tack. You get the point. Yeah, we do, and I think most people do nowadays too, Taz. What happened in 2020, what began to be revealed about what was happening in this country, because it was happening now very, very openly with COVID was a great start to this. And the many things that happened in 2020, the revelation of how these journalists were just lying, straight up lying about what was happening in Minneapolis, and the mostly peaceful protests were incredibly violent and destructive, and many people were killed in those protests. Many businesses burned to the ground. And then you look at listen, you can go around and look at churches in this country nowadays, and what happened in 2020 with the majority of them being shut down. Many of them never came back. They were shut down for good. They tried to do the online thing, and now you know, I just toured an old church the other day, and it was dilapidated because they no longer had the ability to keep it up, and they're stuck with a building that very few people are going to because they were shut down in 2020. Severe intimidation. The lies that we were told about stay home and stay safe. That wasn't true. In fact, the spread of COVID probably was more intensified because people stayed indoors in large groups of people together, and they spread it amongst themselves. I mean, there was so much evidence we knew back then on how to deal with a coronavirus. Coronaviruses are not new. They spread the same way. This one was just particularly bad in terms of the outcomes. I mean, it was dangerous. There's no question about it, but it wasn't as dangerous as we were being told. And we're really going to get into a lot of this on Monday. James David Dixon is going to join me to talk about what happened in these states. In regards, we'll bring up COVID again and how government officials who are making these unilateral decisions in coordination with the news media and Democrats in particular to shut down the states, they lied about the number of COVID cases out there. In fact, Michigan alone, they recently just admitted, yeah, we undercounted by about 200,000. And the reason for that was essentially because it made the virus seem even more dangerous percentage-wise than the number of deaths that were happening per case. Well, if you get rid of a couple 100,000 cases in one state, that increases the fatality rate. And that's what they were doing, things like of that nature to make you afraid and to keep kids out of school for a couple years. Anyway, those are some of the lies, and the media was totally in lockstep with them. And frankly, we were told in the news media to be in lockstep with these government lockdowns and don't push back on it. It was sad. And they still don't want you to talk about it today. All right, let's bring up another one. Taz, thank you for that. Very good comment. Let's bring up Ferris Happenings. What's up? What's happening, Ferris? Chris Wallace left, I believe, to save the embarrassment of being fired in the coming wave. Maybe that's the case because CNN, I think he can see the writing on the wall. I think Ferris, that's pretty astute of you to notice that because, yeah, the CNN is firing maybe hundreds of people, including their top people potentially. Like Anderson Cooper is like pretty much the top dog over at CNN. He's making $20 million a year. And there is there's talk that he might be let go from CNN. Why? Because $20 million is a lot of money. And frankly, their little shtick, it doesn't work. People are fleeing that network. It's same as MSNBC. It doesn't really work. This little shtick of lying to the American people, making it seem that, the president between the years of 2017 and 2021 was really a plant by Vladimir Putin. That didn't stick. And they tripled down on that narrative time and again, including all the other things I outlined at the top of this show, which you can go back and rewind and listen to. Some of the crazy disinformation that the media put out there in lockstep with the Democratic Party. Thank you so much. Yeah, maybe Chris Wallace knows podcasts are the way to go nowadays. That's why I'm in the podcast industry as well. Thanks so much. Let's bring up another one here. Let's go to Gabriel Fragoso. What can we do to protect our free speech online from biased media companies? What strategies can we put into place to protect ourselves besides simply boycotting? Creating silo media organizations just engenders more division. So that is a major challenge, isn't it, Gabriel? Yeah, you silo off, you start doing what the legacy media outlets have been doing for the past 20 some odd years, is you end up splintering into certain groups. We saw that at the beginning of it with the 24/7 cable news outlets, and more of them were developed because they were profitable, but then they kind of splintered the media narrative in a way that's very good because there's no longer a monopoly. So actually that aspect is good. And to Khalil Habib's point, the more voices out there, the better. The problem is, in the digital space, it becomes very easy to silence certain speech because you can, throttle. You can control how many people pay attention to your particular podcast or to your particular streaming episode based on what you're talking about. And that does happen. That's absolutely the case. So, and they do it in a very sneaky way. Throttling is the effort that, the algorithms are set up to, if there are certain words that are said or certain topics discussed, let's make that particular post less visible to the masses, whether it used to be on Twitter. This was happening all the time, happening a lot to me when I would, just in 2020, try to post some real statistics about certain issues that you're no longer allowed to talk about. So they would throttle you. So there is that you can't control that in a sense. All you can do is just continue to speak, and then try to find platforms where your voice will be heard. Because in the end, ultimately, people will start gravitating towards those spaces where the truth is being spoken. And if you can't do that, here's what I recommend: go to church. Churches that speak the truth from a biblical perspective. And, it's not digital. You're in an actual building. And until they shut down the churches in this country, but remember, they tried to do in 2020, and it was very effective for a lot of them as well. And it did damage to a lot of churches. But what happened as a result? People started flocking to the other churches that did open their doors. Some never closed down, and they filled up because people are hungry and thirsty for what's real, what's true. Because what? The truth will set you free. That's biblical, and that's Jesus. And so people want to hear that message. And I think, so whatever it is, find a place to speak and speak freely and speak openly. May not always be on social media. Let's get to another comment, and then I'm going to get to some headlines here. Let's bring up Harry Sakelian is back. Good morning, Tom. I know this is off topic, but I'm wondering what your opinion on Trump's naming Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Love your show, Harry. Thanks, Harry. Yeah, I was actually surprised. Here's what I wish Matt Gaetz didn't do. Listen, he's a very controversial figure in not just the House of Representatives, but over across in the other chamber in the Senate. And so I wish he didn't resign effective immediately. And that's what he decided to do, because it's not a given that he's going to be confirmed. In fact, many Republicans in the Senate said, not a chance. We're not going to confirm Matt Gaetz as the Attorney General. Why? Because he made a lot of enemies. Now, that being said, I've spoken to Matt Gaetz, and I find him to be, in one sense, a breath of fresh air, because he doesn't cave to the listen, when you're in Congress, there is an incredible amount of pressure to stick by the partisan narratives. And there is a group in there in the Republican Party that are very, more centrist in a sense. And so what Matt Gaetz's big issue was that we continued to overspend, and we as Republican, we as conservatives we're supposed to be opposed to overspending. We're supposed to be conservative in our budgets and in our deficits, dealing with our debt, paying down our debt, because eventually it's going to ruin potentially this country. So I respected Matt Gaetz for that. I did not like the way he got rid of the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. I didn't like the way he did that. And I thought that really stalled a lot of things that could have happened in that Republican majority. And, when we first got in 2023, when they first took office, stalled things. In fact, some things never took off because of that. So I thought that was a mistake, the way he handled that. That being said, I agree with a lot of his principles. I don't know him as a person. I mean, I've talked to him, but I don't know him in terms of, there's a lot of accusations against him. But again, politics is a dirty business, and accusations in politics, they're like a dime a dozen. What's true, what's not. Those seeking power, it's a very dirty game, and a lot of lives are being attempted to be ruined in order for the other side to get more power. So I don't know. I think, listen, he's a sharp guy. He's probably a great attorney, and I think as an attorney general, I think he is committed to getting rid of the lawfare that exists in the Department of Justice, and I think he should do that. So all that said, yeah, if he's going to get rid of lawfare and going after your political enemies, then great. He's a great pick. Far better than Merrick Garland, that's for sure. So in that sense, I'm thrilled. Anyway, long answer to a short question. Thanks so much. Let's get to some headlines. I'll go back to your comments here in a second, because this is part of what we're going to talk about, these top stories here. And it's sure to fire up, I think, supporters of President-elect Donald Trump, that the newly elected Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, he's a Republican out of South Dakota. He was not the choice, I don't think, that Donald Trump wanted, but he is now going to be the Senate Majority Leader. He was voted in by his colleagues in a secret vote yesterday. So John Thune, he has promised, he says, to push forward with Donald Trump's key priorities. This is a press conference you're seeing that occurred yesterday. And Thune laid out that the Senate's immediate focus, giving Trump the tools and the support to enforce stricter border security and to remove violent criminals who, as he put it, wreak havoc across the country. So that was a welcome message that he gave yesterday. And then Thune took also direct aim at the Biden administration's policies, pledging to overturn what he called the failed agenda of the Biden-Harris years. The American people have loudly rejected the Biden-Harris-Schumer approach, is what he said. And he emphasized, the unity of his team to usher in change. He was not always a big fan of Donald Trump, so I'm still a bit skeptical on what he's saying here. But I think everyone can agree in the party that, boy, the Kamala Harris and Joe Biden years were incredibly damaging to our country. So John Thune's path to Senate leadership wasn't smooth sailing. After a pretty tight race, he did secure the new role as, a second round vote is what he was able to get his, election into the Senate Majority Leader after a second round. But he defeated his fellow Republicans, Rick Scott, who I think was Donald Trump's favorite, Rick Scott, and then also John Cornyn as well, who is much more like a John Thune. John Cornyn is. Here's what John Thune said. He says, "I am extremely honored to have earned the support of my colleagues." And he put that on X, is where he wrote that. And with Thune at the helm, Republicans are signaling a new chapter in Washington, D.C. And based on what he said yesterday, it's set on delivering Donald Trump's agenda and changing course for the entirety of the country. So if that's the case, I wish him all the best. I wish him all the best no matter what. He's the one that his colleagues elected to be the Senate Majority Leader. Also yesterday, this was a pretty big announcement as well. Former President Donald Trump, the president-elect, officially nominating Florida Senator Marco Rubio to serve as Secretary of State. And this confirmed all the whispers that are out there from earlier this week. We heard about that Donald Trump's words were as bold as ever, calling Marco Rubio a powerful voice for freedom. And he promised that the senator would champion American strength on the world stage. And Donald Trump praised Marco Rubio as a fearless warrior who's going to stand firm against these adversaries. and defend the nation's principles. I agree with that. I think he's a good choice. For Florida now, so Rubio's nomination adds another layer of kind of intrigue to this because his seat now in the Senate is going to be left vacant. So what does that mean? Well, you got Governor Ron DeSantis. He's going to step in. It's pretty pivotal, his decision that he's going to make for appointing a new voice for the Sunshine State to take a seat in Washington, D.C., representing as senator the state of Florida. So many see this as a pretty critical moment as well for the Republican Party, both nationally and in the state of Florida, as DeSantis is going to consider a successor who aligns with conservative priorities and Donald Trump's vision for the country. And I think you can trust Ron DeSantis in that effort, of course. So I think it was a safe move for Marco Rubio to give up that Senate seat to take on this very important role as Secretary of State. So there's also another bold move here that we just kind of talked about. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But this is, I think, a bold move, too. I do like Tulsi Gabbard. She is the former Democrat, then the former independent, now a Republican. And she is now Donald Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence. And that's a pretty significant milestone in his administration's path towards reshaping, America's intelligence community. Because Tulsi Gabbard, she's a former Democratic congresswoman, but she's also a lieutenant colonel. She was in the Army Reserve, and she's journeyed a long way from her run for the Democratic nomination in 2020 for president, now standing as a staunch Donald Trump ally after switching to the Republican Party. And Donald Trump praised her history of service, and he was emphasizing her reputation as a bipartisan figure and her commitment to peace through strength. She's known for her criticism of party politics, good thing. And she's very, very outspoken in her stances on foreign policy. And I think because of that and many other reasons, Tulsi Gabbard has very much resonated with many Republicans, particularly after her scathing critique of Kamala Harris during the Democratic primary debate in 2020, if you remember that. So she's become kind of a hero across party lines. And Donald Trump's statement emphasized that she's got a fearless spirit and a dedication to constitutional rights, making clear her belief that, his belief, I should say, that Tulsi Gabbard's leadership would bring both security and accountability to the intelligence arena. And I've spoken to her as well. She's a very intelligent person, and she's probably a very, very good pick for that job. Also, as we already touched on, Matt Gaetz being picked. That was breaking news that we had at the top of the hour, and also we just had a comment on that as Attorney General. So that means he steps down immediately, and they're going to fill that seat. Again, he's in Florida, so they'll have to pick someone and appoint somebody for that as well. All right, time for another comment or two here before we have to say so long from this edition of Tom Jordan Live. Let's bring up another one. Art Paulus is back. Hey, how you doing, sir? Media is the front office for Democrats. If the left didn't control the media, how would they have succeeded in America? They wouldn't have. That is absolutely the case. There's no question about it. And I've said this before many times, but I would just keep emphasizing that the media in this country is the biggest tool of election interference that we have seen in the past, I would say, couple election, because absolutely that was the case in 2020. It was absolutely the case in 2022 for the midterms. They tried to do it in 2016, but they failed. So what do they do instead? Throughout all of Donald Trump's presidency, they interfered. They began their effort to defeat Donald Trump. If he wasn't going to be impeached and kicked out of office, they were going to defeat him in 2020, and is what they did. So they drew up all these, coordinated plans to, it's this straw man mentality. Let's build Donald Trump as a spy of Vladimir Putin, of Russia. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, let's make sure that let's say he aligns with Adolf Hitler's principles. Well, that didn't work either. And all of these things about him. They tried to, throw him in jail on a number of occasions. They had the January 6th committee that was stacked against him with all Donald Trump hating individual members of Congress. The majority of them were Democrats, and they handpicked, Nancy Pelosi did. They rejected two real conservatives, Nancy Pelosi did, and picked two Republicans that happened to hate Donald Trump, and Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and they went after him, and then they gave all their biased investigation information to the Department of Justice, and the DOJ is trying to use that weaponized committee to throw him in jail. I mean, it's just a whole scheme. I think is unraveling as we speak. And no question, with Donald Trump winning this, and now the Senate winning the Senate, the majority that the GOP did, and now the GOP looks like they've won the House. Hopefully all these things get reversed and exposed, rightfully so. If you care for justice with the Department of Justice, justice matters. And I think justice is about to absolutely, finally come to fruition. One more comment, then we'll say goodbye here. We'll bring it in here. We're just over here. But Catherine Le Esperance, I think I pronounced that correctly. I hope I did, Catherine. Thank you for your comment. We are seeing, for perhaps the first time, the grave evil that is behind our government, the slow erosion of our schools, family unit, and society. We are in a spiritual warfare. You are so right, Catherine, and I would encourage all Christians to pray. Pray that all of this, the evil and the darkness, is exposed, because you touched on a lot of things we didn't get to speak about today. But that is, we talk about the family unit and how many people supported the dissolution of the family unit back in 2020. We went all in on an organization called Black Lives Matter, who very vociferously was opposed to the family unit. They don't like the mom and dad and kids. They were opposed to it, very publicly were, and we went in all as a nation behind them, and dropping on one knee to essentially worship this organization that was spouting these anti-democratic, anti-freedom, anti-civil rights, and anti-family, anti-God messages out there, and people were bowing down to them. It was amazing what we were witnessing. It wasn't about helping black people. The whole Black Lives Matter phraseology was meant to deceive and to hurt people, but that has seeped into our classrooms. It is deceiving these little kids with what they've now openly put into these classrooms and these curriculums. They don't call them curriculums, because if they did, they'd have to tell parents what they're teaching the kids, so they call it training instead. But these are being taught, the training sessions in the classroom, about how if you're a white little kid, you are inherently racist and evil, and there's nothing you, little boy, can do about it. That's what was being taught, with a smile, of course, in league and in partnership with the Department of Justice, by the way. Look into that. They're trying to keep that away from parents, and by doing so, stripping away the rights from parents over their own children. You're right, it is a spiritual warfare. They do it in darkness. They want to keep it in the darkness, but shine the light. Go out there, expose these things, because that's good. The light is good. And pray. Pray a lot for our leaders, even the ones you don't like. Pray that they come to their senses, and they have to confront their own biases in terms of their basically American fundamental values, rhetoric, and beliefs that they have. Maybe they're not aware of it. Pray for them as well. Thanks for a great comment. Appreciate it, Catherine, so much. And thank you for watching this episode of Tom Jordan Live. Of course, we are back tomorrow for another great episode of Tom Jordan Live, streaming live 9 a.m. Eastern on YouTube, X, not YouTube, X, and Facebook. And of course, we're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well. God bless you. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.